What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and with Thor coming out this week, I felt like it'd be a cool idea to, at the very least, just create a bunch of Thor content. And Beta Ray Bill has kind of been a big talking point for the Thor mythos in the MCU for quite some time, whether it's Easter eggs or different things like that. And so I feel like if ever we were going to see Beta Ray Bill in the MCU, now would be it. I don't know that we will, but I think it'd be cool if we did. And so I figured on the off chance that he does appear, I'd make a video called Beta Ray Bill Explained. Plus, it's just a cool thing to do, and we've never done it before. So Beta Ray Bill first appeared in Marvel Comics with Thor issue number 337 in 1983, and he was created by Walt Simonson. Now, if you talk to anybody out there who is a fan of Thor comics and has been reading them for quite some time, they will likely tell you that Beta Ray Bill is one of the most important and one of the most well-known members of the Thor mythos, although probably in the last couple decades, he's sort of fallen out of prominence and really feels like an aging character. Then we'll talk about why over the course of this video. But there was a really good interview that Walt Simonson had done with Daniel Warren Johnson, which was published on Marvel.com, where he outlined why it was he made Beta Ray Bill in the first place. And one of the things to know is that creating comics or coming on as a comic book creator in Marvel Comics, really in the 70s and 80s, was a relatively easy thing to do. All you really had to do was just kind of send in a series of scripts or maybe some artwork or something like that, and it wasn't too difficult for you to get hired on, because at the time, despite their success with a lot of characters they had created, Marvel was still just like a hotbed of all sorts of creative content, and they were really just looking for people to create content for them. In recent years, right now, like in the modern era, it's notoriously difficult to get a job working at Marvel Comics as an artist or a writer, just because of the sheer number of people out there who were trying to do it. But that number was much smaller back in the 70s and 80s. For Walt Simonson, when he was at Amherst, which is an art school, he had actually been reading comics for quite some time and had been crafting a bit of a story that dealt with Surtur, albeit behind the scenes. But he had also considered this idea of having somebody out there or writing an arc in relation to the Thor mythos that simply just hadn't been done before. And so when he was brought on as a writer and artist for Marvel Comics, one of the first things he did was set about basically bringing this story to fruition. And one of the things that had never happened in the history of Thor mythos up to that point in time, especially considering all the work that had been done by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, the old Journey into Mystery stories, the Tales of Asgard stories, there had never been anybody out there who had ever picked up the hammer of Thor and been able to use it. That had just never happened. And so Walt Simonson saw this as a chance to, one, not only turn the Thor mythos or turn the Thor comics into something that was wholly his, but also just make a statement with the beginning of his Thor run. And that's exactly what happened. So one of the things to know about the origin of Beta Ray Bill is that it hasn't really changed drastically over the years in Marvel Comics. And for a lot of characters, it is like that, right? For a lot of origins in Marvel Comics, you don't really see huge drastic changes. But while Beta Ray Bill's origin has been told and retold several times, in the end, it is just a retelling of the origin that we got in Thor 337 through 339. And what we ended up finding out here is that there is a place in the universe that's referred to as the Burning Galaxy. Now, with regards to Beta Ray Bill and the Corbins, right, the Corbinite race, this was just a quintessential example of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the idea of Surtur, who a lot of you guys are familiar with, if for no other reason than Thor Ragnarok, but basically he's prophesized to use the Twilight Sword to bring about Ragnarok, or the end of the Asgardians, that the Burning Galaxy was a place where Surtur wanted to create his Twilight Sword. And so because the Corbins were home to this galaxy, when Surtur and his fire demons invaded, the Corbins had no choice but to flee. And so they started building a whole bunch of ships, like thousands of ships. They ended up basically freezing most members of their race because there weren't enough resources to feed them all and keep them all alive for the journey that was being undergone. But Bill himself had undergone a process of cybernetic augmentation to where he was effectively enhanced. And if there was some kind of an emergency instance that required the protection of the Corbinite race while they were traveling to their new world, that Bill would be activated. And that's exactly what happened. That along the journey following the destruction of his race's planet and their journey to a new world, that he ended up coming across Earth. Now, this was an instance back then when you saw a lot more crossover between comic book characters than you do now. Nowadays, when you look at comic book crossovers, take for example Christopher Cantwell's Iron Man run, you do see some crossover there, but it's by and large part of the main story arc itself. It's not one of those things where a character appears momentarily and they're there to just kind of set the story in motion and then go from there. And even the different crossovers that you see in a lot of ways are confined to like smaller characters. It's not always that way, but it's not quite the same same as it was in the 1980s. In this instance, what you had was Nick Fury as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. that he had come across, or they had picked up on, what was basically a spaceship, not knowing anything about it. And so what he did is he dispatched Thor to basically check it out. And when Thor arrived on the scene, Beta Ray Bill was activated because the ship's scuttlebutt, I know it's a weird name, but the ship's scuttlebutt determined that Thor was an enemy, not knowing what Thor was, and simply because he was literally showing up with a weapon. And so what this did is it led to a conflict breaking out between the two. Now, ultimately, Thor lost his hammer Mjolnir, and this was back in the time in the Thor mythos where if he was removed from his hammer for, 60 seconds or so, he would revert back to Donald Blake. And that's what happened. That effectively his hammer had been knocked away from him, he had lost possession of it, and he reverted to Donald Blake, and in doing so, Beta Ray Bill knocked him out. Following that, Beta Ray Bill picked up the hammer of Thor and basically became the first person to do so, but also set the standard that anybody in the future, whoever picks up the hammer of Thor for any real measure of time, meaning they fulfill the enchantment of being worthy, they'll basically end up taking on the traditional Thor garb, but it'll be modified to fit their appearance. And with Beta Ray Bill being the first person to do that, it totally changed everything. When this story came out, it was landmark. I mean, even to this day, it's still one of the most significant stories in the history of the Thor mythos because it's the first person other than Thor to pick his hammer up. But regardless of how you slice it, the reality here was Walt Simonson wanted to craft this story that kept the reader just glued to everything going on. And so what happened is that following this, the question was, who gets to wield Mjolnir, right? There was a hammer that was created by Odin and has always belonged to Thor. However, suddenly somebody comes along and was able to pick up the hammer and use it for their own ends. And with Beta Ray Bill believing that Thor was an enemy, simply just considered it his reward for having defeated Thor, fans wanted to know, was Thor being replaced? And so what ended up happening is Odin brought the two together and had them face off against one another in a fight to the death. And whoever it was that came out on top would ultimately be the victor, or be the person that would wield Mjolnir from that point going forward. Now, of course, we know in hindsight, Thor didn't die, but that was because Beta Ray Bill chose not to kill him. But it was one of those instances where Bill had overpowered Thor twice. And so what you ended up getting here was basically Walt Simonson establishing Beta Ray Bill as not only the first person to lift Thor's hammer, but somebody who could actually defeat Thor, who was more capable than Thor was. And so as a result of that, it was a prime spot for Marvel to start shopping Beta Ray Bill around. And so with Beta Ray Bill getting his own hammer in the form of Stormbreaker, which was basically forged out of Ruru, right, the same metal that was used to make Mjolnir, it was a chance to showcase what this guy was capable of. Now, one of the things to know about Walt Simonson's run is that while this particular story is one of the most significant stories of his run, it was not the main focus. It wasn't the main effort of Walt Simonson to simply just introduce somebody who could lift Thor's hammer, and then that was kind of like, okay, well, it's all downhill from here. That Walt Simonson's main focus was always the character of Surtur, going all the way back to his days when he was at Amherst learning the art of comics and so on and so forth. He had always wanted to transform Surtur from the old school Jack Kirby, Stan Lee comics into somebody who was a legitimate and credible threat and could actually lead to the destruction of Asgard itself. So while you did see Malekith and other characters introduced, this all came to a head in Thor issues 350 to 353 in what we call the Surtur saga. Now for Beta Ray Bill, again, the main focus of this video, this story is particularly important because with him basically being given Stormbreaker and with the Asgardians helping him to defeat the fire demons of Surtur, saving the Corbinite race, giving the Corbinite race the ability to find a new world which became New Corbin, this story actually began to give us the form in which Beta Ray Bill's role in Marvel Comics would basically take. And that what you saw with the Surtur saga was basically Thor gathering all his allies together and them helping to face off against the forces of Surtur, preventing Ragnarok. But you also ended up seeing like Surtur and Odin fall into a giant chasm, and that kind of seemed to be the end of them, and so on and so forth. But what this did is it set the stage that going forward in the future of Marvel Comics, while Beta Ray Bill wasn't necessarily some kind of unnecessary background character in the Thor mythos, he was never the main star of the Thor comics. And that was one of the things that fans kind of found a little disappointing. If you go back and you read the letters pages at Marvel, or at least coming into the Thor comics for Marvel at the time, while fans didn't necessarily expect some kind of like Batman and Robin type team up regarding Thor and Beta Ray Bill, what they didn't expect is Beta Ray Bill would kind of fall to the background. And so in order to combat this idea that Beta Ray Bill felt like he was kind of becoming a bit unnecessary, that what Marvel started doing was basically shopping him around to different comic books. And so what you saw is that in October of 1985, he was introduced in Power Pack issue number 15, teaming up with the members of the Power Pack team. Now, while that story was geared largely towards kids, it is important because it's one of the first stories really over the course of 2 years when Beta Ray Bill was basically removed from the Thor comics, or not really removed, but taken out of the Thor comics and actually placed in another comic book. One of the issues to come out of this, though, is that with Walt Simonson's run officially ending with Thor Volume 1, issue number 382, this led to a guy named Tom DeFalco writing the Thor comics. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people may say they loved Tom DeFalco's run, others say it's okay. I mean, he did have some iconic stories, for example, Thor Alone Against the Celestials, but for Beta Ray Bill, there wasn't really anything doing here, and in fact, Beta Ray Bill disappeared from Marvel Comics in its entirety for about 3 years. Between 1986 with Thor issue number 372 and 1989 and Thor issue 411, he was gone. Now, eventually he did return, but at the end of the day, Marvel wasn't really entirely sure what to do with him because Tom DeFalco's handling of Thor was not really as much a successor of Walt Simonson's run as it was a spiritual successor of the old Stan Lee and Jack Kirby days. So kind of taking Thor back to that method of storytelling. What this meant is that in 1993, Marvel had the idea of at least temporarily or trying to remove Beta Ray Bill from the Thor comics entirely, keeping him intact insofar as he had Stormbreaker, he looked like Thor, and then actually making him more of a cosmic character. And so while he did team up in the 4-issue mini-series by Tom DeFalco called Thor Corps, which was really the first iteration of it, for those of you guys who are familiar with the Thor Corps stories from Secret Wars, the whole Secret Wars event, the reality here is that in 1995, under Mark Gruenwald, Marvel commissioned a story that basically focused on a group called the Star Masters that largely dealt with the idea that Quasar Wendell Vaughn had been framed, the Star Masters were there to basically prove his innocence, things along those lines. But the reality here is that despite the fact that the team was interesting in the sense that you had Beta Ray Bill, you had Morphex, Quasar, you had Silver Surfer, Zenith, the reality is that it was almost kind of the unsellables to a degree, right? It was characters who were at one point exceedingly popular, who were considered legacy characters, whose names still carried weight. In the case of Quasar, especially during that point in time, following the work of Greg Capullo as artist. For those of you guys who don't know, before he was drawing Batman, Greg Capullo did the Quasar comics back in the 1990s. But also having Silver Surfer, whose name always draws attention, hence the reason he was put on the team. The reality here is that people just weren't really receptive to it. Anybody out there who was familiar with Beta Ray Bill and really his core audience, they saw him as a Thor character, and they wanted him to be a Thor character. They didn't really want him to be deviated away or removed from the Thor mythos. And so while there was an attempt by Marvel to bring him back to the Thor mythos temporarily, the reality here is they kept shopping him around. And the reason why is because in the mid-1990s, one of the things we've talked about before, Marvel was in the face of going belly up, right? The comic bust of the mid-1990s, people who were previously buying comics under the belief that they would be worth a fortune in the future stopped buying comics because they realized that there were so many of those comics made, they weren't going to be worth as much as they were before. And so that almost killed Marvel Comics. Had it not been for Perlmutter and Avi Arad, they would have gone belly up. But the truth about this is that for Beta Ray Bill, he was considered a holdover from the Walt Simonson days, and Marvel just couldn't really write compelling stories about him and didn't quite know where to put him. And so between 1996, with Cosmic Powers Unlimited running all the way up to 2001 with Maximum Security, you saw Beta Ray Bill appearing in those stories and having a role in those stories. But the truth about it is that for a lot of readers, it felt like the days of Walt Simonson and the idea of Beta Ray Bill being a significant character had basically just vanished. In Thor Volume 2 by Dan Jurgens, with issues 33 going into 39 through 41, you did see Beta Ray Bill make some appearances here, but again, there wasn't a whole lot doing. But all this changed in 2004 with a story called Thor Disassembled. Now, the reason why this story happened and the significance of this story is that, in truth, Beta Ray Bill wasn't the only character who was suffering, right? The launch of Event Publications with Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada running that show was really a response to the fact that with Marvel going broke, they couldn't necessarily publish unsellable characters through traditional means. Why pay top dollar to have writers and artists create comics about like Beta Ray Bill or Daredevil if they knew it wasn't going to sell that well? It would quite literally be a loss. They'd spend more money publishing the comic than they would making money selling the comic. And so that's why Event Publications was there. It was a cheaper way to publish comic books for characters that weren't going to have a very high financial turnover. As we've talked about in the past, this led to Joe Quesada coming on as editor-in-chief in 2000 and 2001 at Marvel Comics, and it was basically a fire sale. It was a wholesale just reworking of the Marvel Comics mythos. The marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson was nullified in Spider-Man One More Day. The X-Men team, or the X-Men, really the mutant population, was reduced down to 198 in the aftermath of House of M. I mean, it was a slaughterhouse in a lot of ways when it came to just characters and teams that people had become familiar with. And Beta Ray Bill, oddly enough, was not one of those who was axed, but instead, in the eyes of comic book fans, saw this huge resurgence in popularity. And the reason for that is that with Thor Disassembled, it was basically Ragnarok. It was the long overdue story that fans have been expecting for decades, really since the Walt Simonson run, that basically saw the death of Thor and the Asgardians and the entire mythos that went with it. And so while Beta Ray Bill's role in this story was not highly significant, he was really just there alongside Captain America and Iron Man, fighting alongside the forces of Loki and Surtur and those guys in the midst of the Ragnarok event. What it did is it led to Marvel bringing Michael Oeming back, who had wrote Thor Disassembled, and having him craft a story called Stormbreaker, the saga of Beta Ray Bill. And in a lot of ways, Stormbreaker was as much a philosophical story about Beta Ray Bill as it was your typical comic book story. I mean, in truth, that's unavoidable, right? I mean, this story dealt with like Astaroth, it dealt with Alpha Ray, who was basically the kind of precursor or supposed to be a successor to Beta Ray Bill. The idea that the new Corbins believed that Beta Ray Bill was spending too much time with the Asgardians and basically ignoring his own people. Galactus was involved. There was all kinds of stuff that went on there, right? You saw your typical comic book story. The larger picture here, and really with more focus on Beta Ray Bill than anything else, the story dealt with a couple different things. The first was the question of Beta Ray Bill's place in the bigger landscape now that you basically had the entire Asgardian race, which had been annihilated. The second thing to be asked here is, was Beta Ray Bill really more Asgardian than he was Corbin because he had spent so much time among the Asgardian race? And the third is that Beta Ray Bill was kind of the last holdout of the Asgardian mythos. It was really Michael Oeming and them answering that question by basically having him engage in this final confrontation with Astaroth using what was, by all standards of measurement, the God Blast of Thor, and then essentially destroying himself as well as Astaroth in the process, quelling the threat, but almost seeming to wrap up the entirety of Beta Ray Bill as a character in Marvel Comics. Now, of course, we know that wasn't necessarily the case, and that didn't really last. I mean, quite literally, Beta Ray Bill woke up in issue number 5 in a homeless veteran's body. So by the end of that story, I mean, he was back and alive and well. But the reason why this matters so much is because whenever historically it came to characters in Marvel Comics that weren't really sellable, Marvel didn't really know what to do with them, it would almost kind of be forced. They would put them on this team or that team, and they would basically force readers to try to be, to become acclimated to that character. With Beta Ray Bill, it was a very different approach. What Marvel did is that instead of forcing Bill onto particular teams or forcing Marvel Comics readers to become acclimated to him on different teams or in different scenarios, the stories of Beta Ray Bill, when he appeared in like Omega Flight and so on and so forth, it was really Marvel just trying to relate to the fans through Beta Ray Bill. Where fans didn't know what role Beta Ray Bill had, the stories of Beta Ray Bill mirrored that. He was quite literally just out there in the world trying to figure out what his greater role is now, right? With there not being a Thor, no Asgard, nothing like that, nobody had any idea what any of this meant. And so what you got was him involved as part of the Initiative, which was basically the story arc that took place after Civil War, that where the Civil War stories were predicated on the idea of the superhero initiative, the 50-state initiative, that kind of a thing. Superheroes had to register themselves with like the US government and so on, because arguably the bad guys won and the 50-state initiative went through. He was part of that. As far as Omega Flight went, you saw him as part of the Secret Invasion event, but once Thor and the Asgardians had returned, because a lot of those stories in the early days of J. Michael Straczynski's run dealt a lot with Thor restoring Asgard, bringing back the different Asgardians, different things along those lines, focusing heavily a lot on the Thor concepts in relation to like female Loki and so on and so forth, literally rebuilding that mythos. Beta Ray Bill was not really an unnecessary character, so much as he was a character that was kind of, at least the way the stories were being told, finding his own path in Marvel Comics. So what you got in 2009 was a 3-part series referred to or known as Beta Ray Bill God Hunter. And this was a phenomenal story. And the reason why is because this story was basically just a continuation of Stormbreaker, the saga of Beta Ray Bill. There were some things that happened in between that added to the Beta Ray Bill mythos, but in truth, it was just kind of almost picking up immediately after or relatively soon after the events of Stormbreaker. And so what this saw was that in Stormbreaker, the saga of Beta Ray Bill, Galactus had actually destroyed, like consumed and destroyed New Corbin. This was basically Beta Ray Bill's revenge story. But again, it was very much a philosophical story in the sense that there was a point in that comic when Silver Surfer appeared to Beta Ray Bill and said, "You know you cannot defeat Galactus. Why are you doing this in the first place?" And the reality is that it was really just Beta Ray Bill experiencing an existential crisis. Yes, a lot of him was angry at the fact that Galactus had destroyed New Corbin, and he wasn't necessarily on a suicide mission, but it was one of those things where he's like, I don't know what else I have. I don't know what else I'm supposed to do or where I'm supposed to go. I don't have Asgardians anymore. My people are gone. I don't know, like, I have no idea what it is that's supposed to be happening here, right? Who am I in all of this? Where am I going? What am I doing? What's my place in this bigger picture? Now, what was so great about this is that while eventually he saved Galactus from another race that Galactus was basically being attacked by, and he was rewarded with a mate of his own, that Marvel actually leaned into this. Over the course of Donny Cates' Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 5, this was the main focus, right? The stories that came after that, it was all just a main focus that Beta Ray Bill was just free floating through the universe. So as opposed to it being one of those situations where we would say Beta Ray Bill was free floating because Marvel didn't know what to do with him, it was one of those Beta Ray Bill's free floating because Marvel's crafting stories that fit his current state in Marvel Comics, where he doesn't really seem to belong anywhere. Occasionally he would show up and he would fight alongside Thor. You would see him out there on other teams, but with Asgard and his people having previously been obliterated, and Beta Ray Bill having gone through this sort of spiritual and emotional quest of finding out who he was, that took priority over him returning to the Asgardians. Because in a lot of ways, Beta Ray Bill's character had progressed on such a personal and emotional level that, ironically enough, as angry as fans were back in the 1990s of him being taken away from the Asgardians, in a lot of ways, they kind of didn't want to see him go back now. They wanted to see this sort of personal journey of Beta Ray Bill as he progresses and goes through all of this. And so where you saw stories like the Thanos Imperative, and you saw him, dealing with Thor the Unworthy following, his inability to lift his own hammer and all that kind of stuff, the truth about this is that with Jason Aaron's run on Thor God of Thunder and so on, that Beta Ray Bill just remained a background character, shifting around from team to team, occasionally teaming up with Thor, doing a few things here and there. Now, this has changed a lot in Donny Cates' current run on Thor, in the sense that there was a great big huge conflict when you initially saw Galactus showing up to Thor saying the Black Winter was coming and that there were several worlds they had to consume in order for Galactus to possess enough energy to defeat the Black Winter, that Thor as the Allfather became the new Herald of Galactus. Beta Ray Bill stood in the way of that. A fight broke out between the two, and Thor destroyed Stormbreaker, and so Beta Ray Bill's weapon was now gone. In an effort to make amends for that, what Thor did was bring Beta Ray Bill on as what was essentially the weapons master of Asgard, meaning he was in charge of all the arms and armament. Is this Beta Ray Bill being in a role that's comparable to the old Walt Simonson days when he fought honorably alongside Thor, he had his own hammer, that kind of a thing? No, it's just the gradual shift of his character. Now, knowing Donny Cates, that will likely change, and Beta Ray Bill will be elevated to a highly significant role, because Donny Cates is nothing if not an avid comic book fan. You can just tell by his writings, but he always builds up to a bigger role. And so the position that Beta Ray Bill has now really feels more like Donny Cates is just kind of holding him there until he gets to the point in his writing when he wants to basically bring out the big guns, bring out Beta Ray Bill, have some great big huge moment. But beyond that, that's the story of him, right? I mean, there are some things we left out here, right? Beta Ray Bill's dealings with Jane Foster, but we'll talk about that when we make a video that explains Jane Foster Thor, because while we have covered her stories, we've never done a proper video for those individuals who don't have time to watch all of her stories and are just looking for a more straight up explanation of her character and her publication history. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.